Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our today's second panel, which is named General Experience and Memories. You might notice that we are less on the panel than initially is planned. Kirsten Gerland couldn't come to Warsaw, so we have the fortunate situation then to have more time for the other panelists. And I would like to introduce shortly Mrs. Ljubica Spaskovska. Originally, she is from Macedonia, but her academic career she made in Great Britain and at the university in Exeter. And the recent project she is involved in on 1989, Rethinking the Fall of State Socialism in Global Perspective. And now we hear her presentation on the last Yugoslav generation, making sense of post-socialism and the end of Yugoslavia. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers for the kind invitation. So, my presentation. Well, I'll repeat it again. I'm delighted to be here, and I would like to thank the organizers for their kind invitation. So, this presentation is part of my doctoral dissertation, which I have recently completed, and it's really the last part focusing on memory and remembrance. So, just to put it into context and to give you some background, my larger project examined the different ways the publicly prominent and active youth actors in Yugoslav late socialism in the 1980s, from the spheres of media, art, culture, and politics, sought to re-articulate Yugoslavism and redefine their link to the state. My research argued that the Yugoslav youth elite of the 1980s essentially strove to decouple Yugoslavism and socialism by framing their either artistic or media or political activism as anti-normative rather than anti-Yugoslav or anti-institutional, by progressively taking over what I call the youth infrastructure. That was the youth media and the different alliances of socialist youth, and hollowing out their dogmatically understood socialist content. So just to give you a sense of what kind of activism and alternative culture this generation was promoting in the 1980s, these are the front pages of some of the youth magazines. These were not underground publications. They were officially financed by the Yugoslav League of Socialist Youth. But as I have argued, this generation has managed to carve out spaces of let's say, freedom, as they say in their interviews, niches where they could articulate this critique. So today, as I said, I will focus on how this generation remembers socialism and how it reflects on the fall of Yugoslavia. So the paper uses oral history interviews to reflect both on the trajectories that have been followed in the wake of Yugoslavia's demise in 1991, and the way in which respondents have attempted to make sense of their experiences in this new context and in these new countries, for that fact. So I've outlined two trajectories, two dominant ones, although there are many nuances and overlaps. So trajectory number one relates to the internalization or reappropriation of an anti-communist and a very outspoken anti-Yugoslav discourse, where one resorts to erasure of suppression of one's socialist past from professional biographies. I will explain this is more typical for the so-called youth socialist functionaries, so who were involved in youth politics and then stayed on in post-Yugoslav politics. The second trajectory is the narrative of a generation which was involved in the more, let's say, alternative spheres of youth activism, such as media, culture, rock music, punk music, journalism, etc. And this is a narrative that focuses on the sense of loss. So this generation portrays itself as the generation that lost its freedom in many ways. I'll explain how. Its dignity and its superiority to the other countries of the former Eastern Bloc. So to start with the first narrative, the first trajectory, as I mentioned, these were the socialist functionaries who, for the most part, turned into conservative or staunch anti-nationalists. So yesterday, Professor Kubik, I think, mentioned the three mnemonic warriors in the cases of Slovenia, Hungary, and Poland. So one of those was the Slovenian Democratic Party, and this is the person who was and still is the president, Janez Janša, the former prime minister of Slovenia, minister of defense. At the moment, he is imprisoned for corruption. So in the 1980s, he was a very prominent youth functionary. However, there was a turn in 1988 when they were tried, a group of four, where he was the leading person, they were tried for disclosure of military secrets. It was a very famous trial, I won't dwell on it, in Slovenian and in Yugoslav late socialist politics, because it was really the turning point, and it mobilized the Slovenian public to really voice their discontent and their powerful demands for the reform and the confederalization of Yugoslavia. So he spent a couple of months in prison, to be fair, in the 1980s, however, was released and became a very prominent politician in the post-socialist Slovenian political scene. So his writings recently and all of his political activism has been, can be reduced to what James Mark, as yesterday we've heard, has referred to as the trope of the unfinished revolution. So, for example, in an article Janez Janša wrote recently, entitled, "Did the Berlin Wall really fall down on both sides?" referring that perhaps it didn't fall down on the Yugoslav side, although ignoring the fact that Yugoslavia was never strictly behind the Iron Curtain. However, this is erased, and he goes on to argue in his article that there is a trend of recommunization of Slovenia and the Western Balkans in general, where communists are taking over, etc., and that the neo-communist propaganda nowadays is extremely powerful. Of course, completely leaving out the fact that he was part of that communist or socialist elite himself. So there are also other cases. The current Macedonian president was also a very prominent socialist youth functionary, and in his official biography, this is completely omitted. So, for example, it just mentioned that he was a member of various youth organizations. Which were these various youth organizations in socialism? We know that there was only one, and the notion of socialism is completely deleted, erased. And not to mention the Montenegrin prime minister, etc. So the current political elite in the Balkans is really the youth political elite from the 1980s. And of course, this begs the question, why? How to account for the radical shifts in political beliefs and personal trajectories among individuals who were not only socialized within the Yugoslav socialist framework, but also voluntarily participated in its institutional youth and political structures. They were not dissidents in that sense. They did not rebel, but on the contrary. So there are three possible explanations. Of course, there are more, but I would like to point out three. So in the literature, people have emphasized the major historical shifts and changes of socio-political paradigms that condition certain generations to transform and adapt. So I would like just to mention Mary Fulbrook, who has written on generations in the Third Reich and in the GDR. And also Karl Meinheim's argument that early impressions tend to coalesce into a natural worldview of the world, even if the rest of one's life consisted in one long process of negation and destruction of the natural worldview acquired in youth, the determining influence of these early impressions would still be predominant. And this is clear in the case of Janša I've described, where he's always identifying himself against the Yugoslav past or against the Yugoslav paradigm, the socialist paradigm. So it's inherent in his self-definition and self-perception. And finally, what I discovered was that membership in the youth organization in the 1980s, in late socialism, was a career-driven act. So this was pointed out by sociologists also at the time, that the youth is careerist, they're joining the organization not being motivated by socialist or political values, but simply as a social mobility ladder. The second trajectory I mentioned was what I've called the progressives. In general, although these individuals are all around, let's say, the liberal left spectrum, and in the 1980s, they started identifying themselves first as liberal socialists, and then really they were the ones who established the first liberal political parties in the region. So their critique, I've conducted 40 oral history interviews for my PhD. Their critique was largely targeting the reduction of post-socialist politics in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia, to elections and struggle of power. Then the reduction of the free market to ruthless capitalism. And thirdly, the withering away of the welfare state. So there is a general sense of disappointment with how the transition to liberal democracy was conducted. I don't have to repeat this, this is obvious, but especially here, what is important to point out that Yugoslav market socialism, they, in their view, had a great potential to be, reformed without such major, let's say, fractures and laying out of workers, destruction of the industry, etc. And of course, the neoliberal reforms, which they see as eroding the welfare state. So I will just, to illustrate and to finish off, three very prominent narratives within this group. So first of all, a narrative of disillusionment, which really reflects a sense of perpetual crisis that frames the perception of Yugoslav socialism in itself as emancipatory and hence more benign. There is, people are, as you see from this excerpt of an interview, people acknowledge that that system was authoritarian, but however, what we have now is even worse. So, for example, one of my interviews said that our tragedy here is that those who were quote-unquote dissidents were actually fascists, nationalists. That's the difference between here and Poland, the Czech Republic. There you had Havel as a dissident, while here you had Tudjman, Ćosić, all of these post-Yugoslav nationalists, etc. That's our tragedy. There lies the key to our tragedy. That regime was doubtless undemocratic, we shouldn't glorify it, but compared to this, that regime was not fascist. These are fascists. These are fascists. In that sense, that regime was 100 times more humane. This is a very prominent narrative, especially among Bosnians and Herzegovinians, where the war really had a very, very profound impact on how they relate to the Yugoslav past. The narrative of freedom and how freedom is conceptualized was very also interesting for me and striking, because I never posed a question about freedom directly to my interviewees. I never asked them, was there freedom? Did you feel free or unfree? But they somehow always ended up talking about freedom. So in the 1980s, I argued it was a generational obsession with freedom, understood as political and civil rights. So primarily freedom of expression and freedom of speech. This was the core of their activism. But today, the concept has become synonymous with freedom of travel and social and economic rights. Two features of their lives under Yugoslav socialism, which are now to various degrees diminished. Essentially, freedom today becomes an umbrella term which denotes and connotes all kinds of experiences which seem unavailable in the present and were available in the past in a wider framework, be it Yugoslav or European or international. So, an excerpt from another interview. As far as freedom, or the feeling of freedom is concerned, the feeling of being in possession of a red passport, so the red passport is the metaphor for the Yugoslav passport, with which you could travel freely all around the world without having to apply for visas. From today's perspective, that was utopia. On Oxford Street in London, you could exchange Yugoslav dinars into pounds. How does this sound to you now? A mission impossible, right? So also this is conditioned, of course, by the visa regime, which was imposed on the former Yugoslav states. There are differences and nuances between different Yugoslav republics. I don't put them all in the one basket. Slovenia differed, let's say, from Serbia and Macedonia. But this sense that once you were able to travel everywhere, and today this freedom of movement is restrained. And finally, a narrative of loss, a very prominent one. I refer here to what Steph Janssen, prominent anthropologist, defined as the sense of geopolitical dignity. So I've been talking in my thesis about the loss of geopolitical dignity. So this basically boils down to reflection on Yugoslavia's former prestige and prominence internationally, and a sense of different engagement with the Western world was central to this generation's self-definition. So they've always pointed out in their interviews how they used to travel to the West, record their albums in London, in Italy, etc. So the last excerpt to illustrate this. Yugoslavia was a big country, Macedonia is small. There was a clash of histories, mentalities, traditions, which allowed you to participate in debates which opened up all possible aspects. And this provincial spirit which exists today, because of the dimensions of the state we live in, did not exist at the time. Secondly, it's also a numbers game. When you live in a country of 22 million, the opportunities are understandably bigger than in a country of 2 million. So again, this sense of being at the periphery and being provincialized. So always in a contrast to the more, let's say, cosmopolitan or global engagement of Yugoslavia on the global scene before. So to conclude, the last Yugoslav generation has been generally remembered through its achievements in culture and sport in the 1980s. It has been often represented as a generation which epitomizes urbanity, cosmopolitanism, nonconformism, and late Yugoslav culture. In reality, individuals who were actively involved in late socialist youth politics, media, or culture followed very diverse trajectories. Some pursued their nonconformist engagements in the realms of media and culture, while some remained wholly or partially faithful to their liberal or progressive youthful ideals. While yet another group chose to abandon or erase their socialist past and completely redefine their politics. Narratives of defeat, generational responsibility, loss of geopolitical dignity, and disillusionment with the post-Yugoslav reality and post-socialist politics were intertwined among my interviewees with wider reflections on the Yugoslav past, as well as with evocations of a sense of cosmopolitanism, a different way of engaging with both the Eastern and the Western world, and a somewhat generational obsession with freedom. Indeed, individual professional trajectories and the different post-Yugoslav trajectories of the Federation's successor states proved to be determining of the ways individuals reflect on their generational experience, on the 1980s, and on the Yugoslav past. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Spaskovska, that you kept in time, although we have the privilege to have a bit overtime. And that you made a point on the country or region which we usually don't pay much attention if we are speaking about the heritage of communism in Eastern Europe. I mean, you mentioned it that Yugoslavia was not part of the Soviet bloc and was an independent country, but nevertheless was in different ways connected with the region and also with Soviet Union or with Russian, if you are looking to Serbia. And for me, it was striking how the division and to become a small country has influence on collective identity. Well, these are some points, and we might bring up in the discussion. But now we turn on then to Mrs. Wooley. She is a PhD candidate at the history department of the Indiana University in Bloomington, and her research is mainly on the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, 1989, and right now she will present us her theme, We Were the Generation of Unspoken Assumptions, General Identity and the Velvet Revolution. Please.
My paper is a bit different insofar as I'm going to focus on one case study, or one interview rather, in particular. I actually did this interview as part of my dissertation research, which looked at the Czechoslovak student movement both in 1989 as well as 10 years later, as it's resurrected as a kind of collective memory social movement called Thank You Now Leave, which is going to challenge the legitimacy of the then Czech state at the 10th anniversary of the Velvet Revolution in November 17th. And so my oral histories are actually dealing with activists, or focusing rather on activists who were part of not only the student movement, but also who took part in this kind of reenactment of the revolution 10 years later. And in particular, or rather specifically, I do interviews with 13 student activists from the time of 1989, in addition to another 9 interviews with people who were also active at the 10th anniversary, in addition to 5 interviews that I had done with Slovak student activists. And so I'm going to be focusing, or rather deriving my conclusions today from this entire body of interviews, but focusing on just a few of them in order to make my point. I want to start off by laying out the key concept I think that my paper is contributing to today's discussion, and that is the concept of unspoken generations. Now, this is the idea which is used by the narrator I'm focusing on today, Václav Bartuška, who was very active not only in the student movement, but he also became a leader in the investigation as to what happened on November 17th and played a large role in representing the students in the official investigation of December 1989. As part of this representation. And he uses this term, the generation of unspoken assumptions, to describe how he considers his generation, which is the generation of November 17th, or the generation of 1989 in the Czech lands. So in my paper, the one that I circulated, I discussed some basic concepts of generational formation, including enteleky, which is the articulation of a specific collective identity around a formative historical event. And of course, Karl Mannheim has given us this kind of proactive understanding of when a generation moves from location into an active appropriation of a collective identity. Now, the Czechoslovak student movement of 1989, in November and December of 1989, represented precisely a group which was on its way towards such an enteleky. And I want to make clear that this is not simply secondary analytical hindsight. Part of my dissertation was looking at archival research, including approximately 15 student newspapers from 1987 to 1991, and I studied the formation of a generational consciousness both before the events of November 17th, as well as its kind of articulation afterwards. And with the emerging student movement, it calls itself the independent student movement of the late 1980s, one of the recurrent themes, which is going to create effectively the beginnings of an imagined community within these newspapers, is precisely the question of whether or not they constitute a generation, and if so, what does this generation actually stand for? And you actually see this from a number of different arenas if you a lot of different examples there. Employing Reinhard Kostelik's dynamic between the horizon of expectation and the space of experience, it can be said that the people who took part in the student movement of 1989 expected that a generational formation would come out of this. I can just give you one example from one of the biggest student movement, or student newspapers, Studenckie Listy, which was published by the journalism faculty in Prague. One of the writers, Dan Hruby, in an article called Generace 17, or Generation 17, describes the emergence of 3 generations in Czechoslovakia. And this article comes out in December of 1989. And so you can already begin to see the formation of this division, according to age, between the generation of the grandparents, or the 45er generation, which was most closely connected to the emergence of Stalinism and kind of the political activism of the early communist years. Then you have the generation of the parents, the so-called 68er generation, whose political activities were most closely connected to the Prague Spring, and also whose fortunes were most closely shaped by the Warsaw Pact invasion of 1968. And then finally, you have this nascent 1989 generation. Dan Hruby says that he hopes that this will be the happy generation of fulfilled expectations. And so very much here you see not only this understanding of a generational subjectivity, which is going to be linked to the events of 1989, but also the hope that this 1989 generation will differ from previous ones precisely because they will be able to actually carry to fruition the political program, the ideals which are going to help to generate them. By the time the Thank You Now Leave movement emerges in 1999 at the 10th anniversary, and also in the early 2000s, or the mid-2000s rather, when I was doing my interviews, this expectation had actually produced very different experiences. And in turn, this had fundamentally shaped the contours of how members perceived this collective identity. Studenckie Listy produces a special version or a special edition at the 10th anniversary, and one of the key articles there is asking whether or not a generation of November 17th actually exists. And so we've moved from a question of kind of assumption of existence to the question of whether or not this existence not only is in play, but also whether or not it is even appropriate to have a generational identity. And of the 10 different responses that were given in the newspaper, most of which were from major student activists, and the people that I did my interviews with included both regional activists as well as some of the biggest nationally known names at this time. Only a couple of these people would unproblematically appropriate the idea of the generation of November 17th. Almost every single other one of them, either they said, no, it doesn't exist, or they accepted, but with very specific qualifications. And it's these qualifications and this change in the realm of expectation as a result of the experiences of post-communism that I want to focus on today. And the examples that I included in my paper, and the one example that I will focus on today, will represent some of the elaborate strategies, both cultural and rhetorical, that my narrators will employ to avoid appropriating the generational identity. And what I want to argue in this paper, looking at these very specific individualistic negotiations of collective identity, is that this rejection of generational identity was not based solely upon personal aversion or personal experiences with people who were part of the same generation, but rather it reflects cultural frameworks in which the identity of generation is conceived of the collective identity. It's conceived of historically as an artifact of the socialist past, and therefore illegitimate for use as an appropriate and authentic representation of the ideals of the Velvet Revolution in the later era. Generational identity just briefly composes a we feeling that Ulrika Jeit has described as an imagined community. And this imagined community, of course, incorporates both individual as well as the collective mapping of experience upon a shared plane of understanding. However, the problem of Entschlecki has been particularly foregrounded, in particular in discussions of the generation of 1989. And just to name a few of the researchers who have pointed to kind of a region-wide, or rather a common problem with the appropriation of this generation, Klaus Legvey in Germany in the 1990s argued that the time for generational formation was actually past because after the Velvet Revolution, after the peaceful revolutions, the postmodern moment of collective fractured identity made it difficult to return to this kind of unified sense of a collective mission, which lay at the heart of generational identity. And he noted that in Germany in 1996, when he was writing, this generation had not yet emerged. In fact, Legvey calls this social group the ungeneration. And I actually take the title of my dissertation, which is the anti-generation, precisely from this understanding kind of a rebellion, or rather an inversion of this traditional social category. And we talked a little bit yesterday about the difference between anti-communism and a-communism in kind of the founding myths of the peaceful revolutions of 1989. And so I want to draw upon that idea, but to translate as this idea of an anti-generation, not in the sense of an anti-communism, but as an a-generation, kind of moving against the normative values of the collective identity, in particular as my interviewees understand it, because so much of it depends precisely upon their apprehension as to exactly what this collective identity means, not only in terms of their experience, but also whether this collective identity can be used to articulate authentically their personal identity in their narration. So, personal rejection, I argue, is in part in personal rejection of this identity, is in part an assertion of the ideals of 1989 that reject previous collective categorizations. And to that end, the concept of generation, and here we can understand it as generation with a capital G, a concept that we can trace through historical semantics, it evidences what Reinhard Koselleck has called the contemporaneous of the non-contemporaneity, or the presence of multiple temporalities within the usages and understandings of this particular concept. And so we actually have a number of different competing values which are inscribed into this collective identity that, that will be part of the narration of my interviewees. As I argue in my paper, and in particular in the excerpts that I've included, the strategies of resistance speak to the performance of absence as the preferred articulation of this relationship between the we image, or the we identity, and the I identity that each one of these people prefers to appropriate for themselves. And of course, these individual narrators are in turn going to be creating this particular we-I relationship towards a collective identity that in 1989, remember, they unambiguously appropriated. This was not something that was up for question in any of the student newspapers that I looked at. This is not something that comes into question until later on. So what I want to look at just very briefly, kind of returning to this idea of unspoken assumptions, is to consider the question of silence and absence as negative rhetorical strategies for articulating identity. The oral histories that I include in my paper are all from three men who are key players in the 1989 student movement. And so this question of their rejection of this particular identity is not a problem of lack of knowledge. It's also not a problem of being on the periphery. These are three men who are specifically in the movement, are very central to the movement. Their difficulties with this identity a decade later, therefore, represent a shift in the orientation of their own identity towards this collective one. And so one of the things that kind of alerted me to the fact that this was perhaps not just a personal rejection, but indeed we could contextualize it within broader cultural codes of absence and silence, was the kind of use or the semantics of silence and the semantics of absence, in particular, that were pertinent for this particular group. And so I just want to talk very briefly about two different symbolic constellations which are going to help give us an understanding as to the collective cultural dimensions of what absence and silence could possibly mean. And the first comes from Czech nationalism. Anthropologist Ladislav Holy, who has actually been mentioned previously, borrows from Czech semiologist Vladimir Matsura to argue that Czech nationalism itself is tacit and implicit, in part because of the early experiences in the Czech lands being the dominant nation in a federal Czechoslovakia. And therefore, implicitness and silence are part of the cultural construction of identity for Czechs on a collective national level. Holy also differentiates between two different understandings of the individual-society relationship during the Velvet Revolution. And he argues that the idea of freedom during the Velvet Revolution is still conceived of as a freedom for the nation or the collective, rather than solely for personal freedom. And this will actually be important for the second example that I won't necessarily have a chance to get into today. So on the one hand, we have the national understandings of absence kind of encoded into Czech nationalism. And of course, this is understood very abstractly. We're going to want to think about it on a more personal level. But then we also have the understanding of absence in the culture of late communism. And for that, I turn to Russian anthropologist Svetlana Boym, who describes the late communist cultural practice of counter-memory, which were ways of organizing private collectivities outside of the official collective, outside of the official we, which were created, constructed, and designated by indirect figurative language, silences, ellipses, unfinished sentences, half smiles. A great deal of meaning was embedded within the unspoken, unarticulated, and implicit relationship between personal people or between persons outside of the official culture. And continuing with Boym's anthropological description of the social uses of silence, I evoke both absence and silence to understand them here as performatives as well as cultural codes. And in particular in the Czech context, kind of understanding this use of silence within the Czech language, I also draw upon Czech linguist Irina Vankova, who in Mlčení a řeč, Silence and Speech, published in 1996, discusses some of the symbolic valences of silence in the Czech language. So in order to kind of describe how all of these things come together in the rejection of a very specific understanding of generation as part of the articulation of a generational identity, I turn to ex-student activist Václav Bartuška. As I mentioned before, he was the student representative who was involved in the official investigation into the police assault of November 17th, and he later writes a book, Polo Jasno, which details it, and a very interesting movie was made out of that too. So, Bartuška, in our interview, actually, I conducted all of my interviews in Czech, except for this one particular aspect. He speaks perfect English, and we finished the interview, and so we were just kind of talking, sitting afterwards. Ended up with an hour and a half, basically going into an analysis in English. And this is actually when he came up with this phrase, and he came up with this phrase in English. We were the generation of unspoken assumptions, and he actually used that to explain why the generation of 1989 had actually never achieved enteleki in the final result. For him, the generation of unspoken assumptions meant that the Czech students didn't have a specific program for what would come after the revolution, because all those who could have been politicians had already left the movement. Moreover, everyone in the student movement, and this is also very much part of this implicit understanding of the collective identity, had just assumed that other people agreed with their ideas. Basic ideas of freedom, democracy, effectively were put onto the stage without necessarily being interrogated. And as a result of not questioning these ideas, no one puts them to the test, and effectively a generation doesn't emerge after this experience precisely because no political program is formulated specifically to represent this generation's contribution to the new political scene. Among the groups that Bartuška does consider to be actual generations are the 68er generation, who have unfulfilled expectations, but they have a very specific political program. They also speak a common language. Fidesz in Hungary is also considered to be a political generation because they had formulated their ideas and acted upon them through a viable political party. Because the Czechoslovak student movement contained too many different opinions and political orientations, in the end, it could not create a viable historical response to the changing times. And this, for Bartuška, is why, regardless of the experiences of the time, effectively, the Czechoslovak student movement never fully comes to fruition. and Bartuszka argues because of that they cannot constitute a generation. In other words, the personal experiences of the 1989 students are not sufficient. Generational status is not conferred because they never produced a coherent political enunciation of the goals of the revolutionary events, which were distilled through the interest of one group. Bartuszka's understanding of what constitutes a generation is specifically political, rather than social, cultural, or historical. And it links group destiny to the legacy of the revolution in a very specific way. And it is also significant that Bartuszka tells this to me in English, because as he commented to me in Czech, he is a lot nicer, or as he commented to me in Czech, he is actually a lot nicer to his revolutionary colleagues, because in English he can be more penetrating in his analysis of what happened. He told me that in Czech, words automatically have quote-unquote certain meanings, which frame his memories and make it difficult for him to judge events outside of them. And I focus on the way this silence mediates his narration of events through this concept of the unspoken assumptions. And the understanding of silence here, I looked at a number of different places to kind of approach this cultural concept of silence, and of course one of the first places to go is Holocaust testimony, the difficulty of survivors articulating their understandings and articulating event which is really at the limits of human experiences. But this is not what this kind of silence is. This is not about an indescribable or incomprehensible experience. I included a couple of extended excerpts in my paper online. The silences actually came as a result of not wanting to appropriate the identity. However, the reasons for not appropriating the identity in every single case were actually very elaborate. In some cases, they took up 20 or 30 minutes of discussion and self-analysis. So there was very much a kind of engagement with this idea. It was precisely the taking of this identity for the personal narrative, which was refused. So the silence is not such as the silence in the case of a Holocaust survivor or a trauma victim who can't give voice to their experiences, precisely because it lies outside of the norms of language and normal processes of identity formation. Rather, silence in 1989 for Bartuszka mediated between the diversity of the student activists in order to create a common platform for the movement. The unspoken assumptions here reflect the implicit cultural codes that young people involved in the student movement developed during the last years of communism, and this allowed them to bridge their differences to work for a common goal. Irena Vankova links the implicitness within silence by referring to Vygotsky's concept of internal speech, the pre-verbal formation of meaning before linguistic articulation. And she notes after Bakhtin that understanding is always dialogic. And what else is understanding, as she points out, then recognition sui generis. Vankova argues that speech and silence are often closely linked in the communicative process, as many situations occur where one does not need to say anything in order to be understood. This level of implicit understanding is precisely what Bartuszka highlights in his phrase of generation of unspoken assumptions. However, he interprets this not as empowering, but rather as constraining. And it's also the implicit assumptions within the Czech language which prohibit him from creating a fully developed analysis and a fully developed critique of his own generation. The collective experiences of 1989, therefore, produced expectations that could not account for their development afterwards. And Bartuszka explains this divergence by relying on what for him is an appropriate formulation of generational identity. Now, of course, this diversity actually has parallels within the general umbrella movement against communism. The mobilization spearheaded by the students and actors, as well as Civic Forum, Public Against Violence, and other democratic movements in Czechoslovakia in 1989 were known specifically for being broad-based, ideologically diverse. This is one of the key features, the key characteristics of the peaceful movements of 1989. They, of course, also self-consciously refused to advance a totalizing political program, once again, another feature of these peaceful civic movements, as a part of their very self-conscious and very clearly articulated rejection of the Bolshevik model of total political revolution. Also, their rejection of a utopian future and the rejection of collective guilt for the members of the ancient regime. So Bartuszka's ambivalence towards the idea of a revolutionary generation also reflects a rejection of the collective structures of meaning under state socialism. During this time, generations were political formations of social groups, and they were conceived of precisely as the representatives of an age-based political articulation of the communist project. And for this, you can just go back to Lenin conceptualizing the Communist Party as the party of youth against the older social democrats who represent the old regime which must be overthrown. And so youth concepts, concepts of age were politicized, and of course these will be translated into social codes and social categories during the communist era. So returning to the collective versus collected dichotomy that we've been discussing in this conference, this is a moment in which collective memory, or the collective memory of generation, really can be highlighted. Jeffrey Olick turns to the example of Halbwachs, Maurice Halbwachs, who of course builds from Durkheim, and the Durkheimian moment, the most collective moment of Halbwachs' thesis, according to Jeff Olick, is, quote, how memory over time becomes generalized images or imagos, and these require a collective context for remembering. Olick goes on to say that, quote, imagos are collective representations sui generis. We can think of this imago also as what Jan Assmann has called a memory figure, or what Gregor Feind et al. In their article on the third wave of memory studies have called mnemonic signifiers, or, quote, any socially relevant figuration of memory which effectively acts as a symbolic shorthand or a condensed figure of meaning for diverse historical events, diverse experiences, and it's precisely this condensation into a transportable symbolic figure that allows for memory to be transported into generations and also into different spatial areas. So the concept of the mnemonic signifier basically refers to the creation of the building blocks of collective memory. And if we understand generation, this idea, as a mnemonic signifier of the communist era, then we can understand exactly why this generational identity will continue to be encoded with a very specific set of meanings and set of symbolic interpretations. Even for our interpreters, or narrators rather, 10 years down the road. Each signifier contains multiple signifieds or interpretations of the past. And of course, these symbolic and figurative meanings can transcend empirical reality of the events, and their uses as memory markers and sites of meaning creation can in turn be traced over time through a history of interpretations. And here we really have a nice kind of contrast in terms of the understanding of generation unambiguously appropriated in 1989, but kind of taken and decontextualized over the course of the first post-communist decade, for Václav Bartuška at least, into a symbol of the old regime, which effectively the experiences of the student movement cannot correspond to. And approaching generation in this collectivist approach as a mnemonic signifier helps us understand how the concept itself mediates between the communist and post-communist era, or rather how it contains within itself this multiplicity of temporalities, which we mentioned before, working from Koselleck. Bartuška understands generation in a very, very specific sense, where experience and expectation of the past will play out in a changing manner over the course of the 10 years that we're talking about. So since the idea of the generation, and this is of course generation with a capital G, failed to meet its criteria for its own existence, Bartuška's idea of the generation failed to exist as a social fact. The generation as a collective fact had a historical task, it did not live up to it, and so regardless of the personal experiences of those people who had taken part in it, the generation itself had ceased to exist. And I don't have time to go into my other example, which actually looks at more collected responses of rejecting this understanding of generation and the reasons why. So I just want to jump down to my conclusion, just so I can kind of give some final comments here. I've tried to show how this refusal to appropriate a particular generational identity is dependent not just upon personal reasons or personal antipathy, but it is also dependent upon a subjectivity which regards generations in very specific ways. Generations, as understood by both Bartuszka as well as Steiner, the other example that I didn't have time to go into, are very specifically political identities, which, when born of revolutions, necessarily must enunciate the revolution's ideological goals as a program for the future population. And in this sense, understanding generations from the interviewee's perspective necessitates taking into account the collective memory regime. Bartuszka's refusal to appropriate the term generation hinges on silence, where uniform assumptions enabled the group's formation, but prevented the members from formulating a truly collective interpretation to the revolution. The other two examples that I use actually turn rather on the idea of absence and the desire not to glorify any of the roles of the students acting within this particular generation. And they effectively are going to appropriate individualistic strategies. But I want to emphasize here one of the elements that I brought into the paper that I posted online that I didn't have a chance to really talk about here, and that is the contextualized nature of this analysis. This tendency towards rejecting the communist version of modern categories such as generation and revolution are a peculiar feature of the late communist habitus, the one which gives rise to the meaning which propels the revolutions in the first place, and of course which will also shape their agents' specific experiences. In the case of Bartuszka, I've tried to show how the dynamics of transition help form the interpretations of this transition for my narrators, and in particular emphasized this, the way in which this particular strategy, this strategy of silence, mediated for my narrators and allowed them to recreate a connection to a generation which had effectively lost its salience and lost its unproblematic and unambiguous nature. However, there is also a caveat to this, and it's precisely that silence and absence are very fragile cultural strategies, and they depend a great deal upon the implicit habitus which is going to bring together particular cultures, which is also very difficult actually to transfer across time to future generations. In this particular instance, I don't want to suggest that anytime anyone, anywhere rejects a collective identity, there is a cultural matrix at work, or that any rejection of generational identity always brings with it a collective aspect to it. However, in this instance and the examples that I posted online, I suggest that when approaching the problematic of a generational identity of 1989, which is a research question in its own right, that it's fruitful for us to consider not just articulation, but also silence and absence as valuable components to entelechi. Through the excavation of unspoken assumptions, we can understand how complex and in some ways positive this rejection of generational identity truly is. Thanks.
Thank you, Mrs. Wooley, for your presentation, and that you shed light on the peculiarities on the generation of 1989 in Czechoslovakia, which obviously didn't come to terms with their participation in the Velvet Revolution in a kind of building up a collective identity, less rather an individualization of this, what they experience and on which it is based on. And now I would like to please Mr. Lars Breuer for his comments. Lars Breuer is a research associate at the Free University in Berlin, and he is taking part in a research project which is named Collective Memory as a Basis for Identification with Europe. Lars, if you would be so kind and to give us
Thank
your
you.
comment.
And I'm afraid I won't touch much upon the both cases, since I'm neither an expert in Czech Republic nor a former Yugoslavia. So I decided to share some reflections on the concept of generation, and I hope I'm not telling you things you already know. In Germany there's this saying of Eulen nach Athen tragen. I was told that in English it's bringing coals to Newcastle, which to me seems a bit outdated, so I don't know how you actually say that in English. Well, in 2011, 3 years ago, at this very conference, Wolf Kannsteiner gave a speech on the concept of political generation, and in his very personal style, he almost denounced the concept, basically saying that it doesn't work at all. I wouldn't go that far, but still I want to share my skepticism, especially with the use of this concept. We all know that generations have become kind of a catchphrase, which is used by journalists and authors, and I would say basically for the reason that it sells very well. And we have all kinds of generations. For example, in Germany there was a bestseller about the generation golf, which I don't even know what it is about. I don't even know if golf refers to the sport or to the car, and but it's been a bestseller, and so obviously it works. But in order to make the concept work for memory studies, I think it's important to have a much more clearer understanding of what the concept actually stands for and how we use it. And this touches upon three aspects of the concepts, and this is first the perspective, I'd say, second the timely dimension, and third the conditions for the formation of a specific generational memory. As for the perspective, Ulrike Jureit, which Deanna also referred to, pointed out that there is an essential difference between generation as a self-description, which can be used by particular individuals or by entire groups, and between generation as an analytical category or even an explanatory device. So, for example, this is used in memory studies, in the sense of an age-specific socialization or communitization. So, as a self-definition, according to Jureit, generation, as I just said in referring to those books, is a very popular category of self-identification, since it's less rigid and more flexible than other identificational categories like nation or class. And it still serves the purpose of those categories, namely providing collective identity, orientation, belonging, and so on. So this is why Jureit talks about a mid-range concept of collectivity. But there is the relationship between those two perspectives can be quite complicated. For example, you can analyze the self-descriptions of certain individuals, like you did, like in that 89 and 10 years later. You can also describe memories with the help of generation as an analytical category. But according to Jureit, what is problematic is when scholars confuse both perspectives and actually adopt the generational self-identification of certain groups and then turn them into an analytical category or explanatory model without really questioning them. So in the following, I will limit myself to the aspect of the analytical concept. And here, it was not by chance that Mannheim was mentioned in both papers, because his essay on the problem of generations is still widely recognized. And it's kind of not unique, but special in the way that it tries to conceptualize both dimensions, both timely dimensions of generation. And we have a diachronic dimension in which generation is mainly perceived as a temporal sequence, so as a genealogy. And this is applied, for example, in studies on family memory, where it's all about the intergenerational transmission of narratives and emotions. And then we have a second dimension which I will focus on the following, that is the synchronic dimension, where generation is rather understood as a genus, as a certain group of people who have lived at the same time. So here generation refers to a specific age cohort. And obviously there is a connection between both dimensions, since most synchronic generations would define themselves in demarcation from previous or subsequent generations. So the whole point of the synchronic dimensions, now I turn back to Mannheim's essay, is that members of a certain generation, so individuals born at a certain point of time, are affected by historical and social conditions, or you could add cultural conditions, in a very specific way. And I think there's an important differentiation between two concepts by Mannheim, which is first the Generationslagerung, which you could translate to generational site, and the Generationszusammenhang, which could translate to generational bonds or coherence. And for Mannheim, the first, the generational site, is simply an objective position, like the class position or the social position of an individual, which regulates certain social opportunities and constraints. And here, the crucial concept is the notion of the formative years, or so the claim is that experiences in the youth age would leave the deepest impression on an individual, and that all later experiences would be interpreted under the frame of these earlier circumstances. Or this is what you referred to as the natural worldview. And I think when writing this essay in 1928, Mannheim clearly had the experiences of World War I in his mind. Yet this generational site for Mannheim is only a potential, a possibility for the shared experiences or the shared habitus, or in this case, the shared memory of a generation. So in order to develop these generational bonds, individuals of the same generation, according to Mannheim, would need to participate in what he calls a common destiny. So this would create a social bonding, or the intellect you've been talking about, this sense of an imagined community, this mutual knowledge of being part of one generation, and then to take it one step further, in order to become a generational unit, or a Generationseinheit, as Mannheim calls it. He says that members of a generation would have to develop a common way of reacting to the special social conditions they are facing. And in a recent reinterpretation of Mannheim's concepts, Michael Korsten has pointed out that if you take these conditions into consideration, the formation of a generational memory is contingent in at least two ways. Because first, you have to have this defining collective event that creates a generational site, and second, you have to have a common interpretation of this event in order to establish generational bondings. And in addition to this, I think that we need to, maybe we can call it historization of Mannheim's concept in 3 points. And first, I think that it's important to stress that Mannheim distinguishes between acquired memories and appropriated memories. So basically, that's what I remember myself and what I've been told by others. And he really puts emphasis on the acquired memories, I think, again, still having in mind the experiences of World War I. But I think that today we are facing a prevalence of appropriated memories, or as Landsberg has called us, prosthetic memories, and which makes it even more difficult to establish these generational bonds. Plus the second aspect, that I think in nowadays fragmented societies, generational sites can still host a variety of different mnemonic communities. So we have differences in class, gender, we have ethnic minorities, migrants, local, regional differences. We have even, as we've seen, different political views. And we have, as we've seen yesterday, we could also imagine different memory regimes also within the same generational site. So the question would be, how can we tell if the generation or the age cohort is really the defining moment for a specific memory community. And the third point is that although the concept of formative years has been confirmed in empirical studies, for example by Howard Schumann and others, the same studies have shown that sometimes memories can be overshadowed by later events. One example Schumann is giving is that in times of economic crisis, the economic crash of 1929 is remembered much more frequently than in other periods. And also theoretically, the concept of formative years or decisive events has been questioned. For example, Gabriele Rosenthal coined the term of interpretative turning points to describe, I quote, biographical turning points which lead to reinterpretation of the past, unquote. And I think this is actually what we have what we see both in the case of Batushka and in the case of Janša. They're not talking about the formative events they've been experienced around 89, but about their reinterpretations from today's perspective. So now coming back to the three papers, still says 3 in my manuscript, so to the 2 papers, I would take Deanna's paper as a starting point, since you were touching a lot on the concept of generation. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the reading I got from, or the point I got from your paper is that actually there was kind of a formation of a generation in '89, but now the respondents somehow made an individualistic turn, and they're refused to appropriate this labor of generation. So, and I would suggest a different reading and question if it is justified at all to talk about generational side at all in the first place. Referring to the conditions I've just sketched, I think that also now I'm referring to your paper you put online, I think that even your interviewees support this view that we cannot, again now if we switch to the perspective of the analytical concept of generation, I think even your interviewees support this view, since we could say, for example, that I'm not sure about this, but I would suggest that not the majority of that given age cohort did not study in Czechoslovakia in '89. Then Steiner says that the majority of those who studied did not take part in the protests. And then Batushka says that even among those who were active in the protests, there were a lot of different agendas which were kind of blurred by what he called the unspoken assumptions. So I would say we could clearly speak about the memory of a given group of activists, but not about a generational memory. And the same, I think, goes for Ljubica's paper, that I think also here the decisive moment is not the generational side of the age cohort, but the political attitudes and activism of the respondents and of the, So the question to both papers would be, can we actually speak about a generational experience, and can we really speak of a generational interpretation? And then we have this question of the formative years versus the reinterpretation from a later perspective. So maybe that's for the more general points, and I do have some more specific questions to both papers. I don't know if we're going to wait with that for.
Yeah, there were at least 2 questions and to both panelists, and if you might answer things shortly, and then I open the discussion to the audience.
Yes, thank you very much for your comments and insights. This has been the issue I've been grappling with while writing my thesis, but I have to mention this was a historical research. It was really writing the history of this generation, and I identified 3 pillars. So I'm sorry, but I'll have to explain. So the generational label was attached to this cohort in socialism. So Yugoslav sociologists talked about 3 generations: the partisan generation, the post-Yugoslav generation, and the young generation coming of age in the late 70s and early 80s. So this was in Yugoslav sociology. Then it was in public discourse. with the 1980s, with the omnipresent political and economic crisis, this young cohort got the label of a crisis generation. So this was really everywhere, in media and in self-identification. So I argue that they reappropriated this label from sociology and from media, generacija krize. So this is how they call themselves. So there was a self-identification at the time. And also, as it was mentioned in socialist theory, in practice, pokoljenje or generacija, it was a very prominent marker, right? So although Yugoslav sociologists really alluded to Mannheim in their research, they consciously appropriated the generation label for their studies in socialism, in a way also to distance themselves from Marxist approaches and the class approach, etc. So I also dwelled on the rejection of this label in part of my dissertation, because there is a part of this cohort which today refuses, but refuses on the basis of disillusionment and disappointment, especially among Bosnians, Bosnian interviewees, precisely because of the war. And their interpretation is that it was not possible to be the same generation, considering that people, my Serbian friend or neighbor, later shot at me, etc. So again, it's conditioned by present-day interpretative frameworks. And last but not least, I was also guided not only by Jurčak's approach on the last Soviet generation, but also other authors who have referred to one inaugural event or a social, in this case, the historical trauma or the social trauma of the breakup of Yugoslavia. So I really took this as one of the defining events for this generation.
That's cool. Yeah, no, actually, many of the same themes I think are going to come up, and it's really interesting that we do see kind of the same collectivist rejection on the basis of, not just this idea of generation, but what comes afterwards, kind of the reinterpretation, which is going to be read back into the past. In the case of the Czechs, so too, and the sociologist, it was this anticipatory generation. It was kind of assumed that 20 years have gone past, so we have to have this generation coming up, and that actually helped to feed into the student activists in the late 1980s, basically asking, what kind of generation are we going to be? And that was, for me, coming from the American perspective, one of the most fascinating aspects of this, precisely the assumption that youth must be a defining category and a categorization, and that it really was part of this very specific, framework of this dominant narrative, this hegemonic narrative of generations as offering something, having a mission, and that would be one of the ways in which these young people basically would be incorporated into the entire communist history, because remember, generation is a method of temporalization, and so this is effectively a historical interpretation of how the society is going to change, and each generation's genius or mission, of course, in turn feeds into this future history, or this future understanding of where this history is going. And so from the standpoint of my student activists, there are numerous articles in 1987, 1988, before even the Velvet Revolution occurs. One of my favorites is Robert Hocker in a medical newspaper. He wrote an article called Generacija se stalo co dal, Generation, It Happened, and What Next? And this is in 1988, before the Velvet Revolution occurs. And in it, he has a very elaborate articulation of this fall of grace, that you had these children who were up in heaven, and they had to fall down to the corrupt world, and all of a sudden they're in their parents' adult world in which corruption and immorality reigns all over the place. And how can these young people find their authentic voice and their authentic face in a place in which every single aspect of society is marred by the everyday kind of iniquities, both moral and economic and political, of late socialism? And so this articulation of a generational subjectivity, specifically against the landscape or the habitus of of late communism. This is very much part of the subjectivity which eventually allows for the creation of the independent student movement. I mean, this is how they differentiate themselves from the people who were the careerists beforehand, and is absolutely crucial to the emergence of this particular movement and its actions in 1989. His is not the only one. There are at least 5 or 6 very in-depth discussions of exactly what it means to be a generation even before the Velvet Revolution occurs. So I think both analytically as well as kind of self-referentially, I think that as much as we would like to say no, because of course my interviewees, they say no, absolutely not, but if you might have noticed for both Scheiner and Dvorak, those 2 examples that I brought in, each one still has a common response to their surroundings by saying we have to be involved in public affairs. We have to work in order to make sure that the changes which were carried out as a result of the generation, to make sure that they stick. And this is actually something which has been noted as one of the characteristics of the people of this generation. So self-articulation, of course, is not the only way that you identify a generation. You also have common habits, common responses. And for that, you see evidence of that. So I think that we have to hold on to this complex idea as much as we might want to trash it.
So now it's questions. Please introduce you shortly. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Dorothee Welling from Hamburg. My first comment is actually on what you said, Lars, when you claimed or when you criticized the possibility of talking about the people involved here and described as a generational unit because there were so little, there were so few. I actually don't think that's a valid argument because generational units in the Mannheimian sense tend to be very small. And even the ones that Mannheim himself refers to, that is the youth movement of the 1920s, is a very small group. I mean, perhaps not as small as the students in Czechoslovakia, but a very specific group of male bourgeois activists of the youth movement. So I still think that's a valid question. But what struck me is that obviously you, Deanna, is that the way you? Okay, Deanna described your group and your respondents as people who rejected to be a generation in a way, a generational unit. But they seem to constantly talk about generation. I mean, that's obviously a problem. So why do they constantly talk about it? Just because they want to reject it. And even they name themselves, or Batushka names this group as a generation of unspoken assumptions. And I was wondering if in denying to be a generational unit, they actually want to prove that they are one, but not one that is heroic, but that one that is tragic. And to be a tragic generation is also a very good thing. I mean, it's cultural capital that you can use in a way. But my question is for your project, if you're also interested in that other level of generation, like experiential contexts, by really looking what the biographies of these people are. I mean, what are they actually doing? What did they make? What did they do after 1989? And is there a social pattern? And then that would be an interesting comment on the way that they describe themselves. Okay.
2 further questions. You and Aline Schirp and...
Aline Zirp, Maastricht University. First of all, Deanna, I think this is a very fascinating project, so thank you very much. It's very interesting. I do have a question to Ljubica. Do I pronounce it correctly? Okay. I was wondering, did you see any national differences emerge here? Because we all know that the social and political context plays a fundamental role if you have people's reactions to certain events and how they define themselves. And well, we all know that obviously the former Yugoslavia is not a coherent bloc. You have very different countries there with very different trajectories. I was wondering how much this played a role when it comes to people's reactions, or do we have some kind of a generational identity that is similar across the board?
Yeah, I'm Anna Delius, and I'm working with Lars Breuer in the same research project. And I think my question is a little bit related to yours. It's also for Ljubica Spaskovska. I would like to know, because you mentioned this one interviewee who talked about the others had Havel and they had these heroes. And I would like to know, is this a typical pattern of your interviews, that they embed themselves in a transnational setting? Is this typical of Yugoslavian memories? Because I think it would be not typical of other memories of other nations. Thank you.
Answer then. You? Well, it's the second round is. First, you can answer.
Okay, yeah. Yes, you're absolutely correct. And that was what kind of alerted me to the fact that even though they were denying the fact that they were part of this generation, every single other thing in their biographies and what they did and how they constituted themselves, we're actually talking about many of the winners after 1989, people who are involved in public service. As I mentioned before, Václav Bartuška, I think I did, he was the head of the Havel Library at this time. You also have people who are involved in Czech radio, people who later go into politics. And so this kind of commitment to the post-1989 regime is something which really brings these people together, but also the opportunities which were available to them to go out abroad to study. Many of them actually were able to do very well after 1989. This is not true of everybody, but many of the students were actually talking about kind of a social and economic winner class effectively there. And so their biographies are most certainly part of why I do what I do. Precisely because in 1999, when they kind of rise back up to challenge the government, they're not the typical losers of the transition kind of protest movement. They're basically people who actually had done quite well. And so then the question is, upon what platform are they saying that the government has not gone far enough in democratic reforms, that Klaus and Zeman need to get out, which never happens because they're still there, and so on and so forth. And so that's what's really fascinating about this group as a social group, because unlike former workers, unlike the pensioners, unlike the people who have economic issues with transition, these are people who truly, they were able to construct their own lives according to their own plans as a result of 1989, and yet still they have this kind of commitment to the carrying out of this revolution on the basis of the ideals as they knew it. And this, of course, is why I've tried, and I have been grappling, I'm sure that you did too, with precisely this idea of absence and negation, because it's everywhere, this idea of generation, and yet you still have kind of a very coherent and consistent kind of response that this generation doesn't actually exist. And so it kind of alerted me to the fact why I was trying to come up with the social and cultural reasons why they would refuse as opposed to the personal reasons. It alerted me to the fact that there was a cultural matrix which was at work here. This framework which made the generation as an identity not appropriate or not authentic. And this articulation had to be separated out from the rest of this deep matrix that we were talking about in terms of shared responses, in terms of shared experiences, in terms of shared memories, to kind of separate out those two elements that are there. Yeah.
Thank you for your questions. Absolutely, there were differences across the different republics, and I talk about that extensively in my dissertation. Of course, it has been well known, and Professor Kenny has written, I don't know if he's here, he's written about Slovenia. So Slovenia was, the Slovenian youth scene was the avant-garde in this sense, but I refused in my thesis to concentrate on one republic because I don't believe in methodological nationalism. I think that if we are to be historians who aspire to some sort of objectivity, we shouldn't map our present-day national and state frameworks onto the past. Yugoslavia was one country, and a lot of these debates were feeding on each other. That's a fact. There were different Republican youth organizations, but there was also a federal one where all of these opinions clashed, and really I think it shouldn't be overlooked. So that's why I decided to choose a Yugoslav lens, but still pinpoint the different scenes, youth scenes. So, for example, it's very obvious that the Macedonians, let's say, the Macedonian youngsters were the more passive ones, but still they were looking up to the Slovenian kind of colleagues and learning a lot of their kind of youth journalism, critique, etc. So, in terms of embeddedness in transnational settings, it's not a dominant narrative. Of course, we have to keep in mind, again, like in Deanna's case, that this was the elite, and it's still the elite. A lot of these former journalists now are editors of weeklies, etc. So these were the people who didn't lose out in the transition, of course. And they reflect those who were mobile in the 80s, who went to Hungary, etc. There was a big Yugoslav debate in '89 about solidarity, the martial law, etc. So those who kind of kept in touch with different Eastern European scenes of activism, they are the ones now who reflect on that. Although I had some opposing views, for example, one Slovenian artist, activist told me that actually for them, sometimes the Czechs and the Poles were too conservative in the 80s, because we, the Yugoslavs, we were really wanted to do something even more progressive. So you also have this admiration, but also a way of distancing.
There were some questions on the left side. Yeah, so then you and then.
Please use the mic.
I would like to ask you, why this generation, 1989, wasn't able construction collective memory, but I am representative generation at University Warsaw, which striked many months in 1980. And my memory was either very ideological. I understand why wasn't this generation in 1989 conception, collective narration, historical narration, but memory versus history. I am a teacher of history. I would need sources. Not only memory, sources. Why? Why wasn't able conception? Why wasn't able consumption, collective narration?
Thank you for your presentations. I have a question for Ljubica. It's about regrets, Daniels. I saw in your research work, did you have chance to notice the differences among the interviewees, whether they regret their involvement in public life during the ex-Yugoslavian times, or is just Daniel because their involvement during in ex-Yugoslavian times does not fit the current social construct, social norms, politics, and so on.
Yeah, My name is Miroslav Vaněk. I am from Institute of Contemporary History, Prague. Thank you both for the great papers. I have a one. Just it's not question. Some maybe notes for Deanna. If she take that, she said that a couple of times that the students movement is just only some few part of the people of the young generation in 1989. I think that the students, like the students activists, were very small, almost invisible to 1989, and that there was most visible not the dissidents, but the young generation, which could be titled like the Little Islands of Freedom. It would be the activists about the environmental movements, about peace movement, about the people who like the rock music and punkers, etc., etc. The students were split among these activities. Now we have the prevailed narratives after the 1989 is that the students are allowed. They are titled in every newspapers, and their narratives is like show just only one. And the people who were really young still, like the students, were, I think, a little bit less loud and not visible. And I think that they were maybe more important for the generation aspect, for the vision, like the generation. If we speak about the generation of the 1989, I'm a little bit skeptic about it, but I don't think that the students were something like the movement before the 1989. On the other hand, they started their activity just in the day, November of 17th, and they continue after this. It was very, very, very inspirative for everybody, but I think before it was so nothing more.
And there was a question from the man in the last row, just besides the translation box. Right?
Kamil. Okay. Kamil Lipinski, Warsaw University. To be honest, I have a question to Diane. To be honest, I'm a bit skeptical about the idea of generation, because for me, at least, is idea of how the ruling class reproduce its authority in a symbolic way. But I have an impression, did you try, because your respondents are a bit of upper middle class, and perhaps their strategies of resistance to define itself as a generation is perhaps due to that they did not feel to have an influence of forming the narration of 89-91, because for example, the people who started up their own company became a successful businessman. They are a dominant class now, at least in Poland. I don't know how it looks like in Czech Republic. So that's why they refrain from defining themselves.
Now I would suggest that you answer.
Sure.
And then there was a third and last round with the questions of Mr. von Plato, Mr. von Puttkammer, and maybe one more.
Okay, shortly. To start off with your question, Marek, actually, I have not said that there was only a small number of people. That's actually, this has been put upon me. And indeed, this is actually a narrative device in the student newspapers, especially the ones that come in December 1989. The phrase, Demina Hori, that all of the students went on vacation, or they're studying, or they went to the mountains, everybody went to the mountains. This is a phrase that you see time and time and time again. And so this critique actually is part of the narration of the Velvet Revolution itself. In terms of the sociological, empirical reality, there were a couple of studies that were done approximately, kind of by students in the strike committees themselves, and about half of the people within a particular obor, in a particular faculty, would be active at the beginning, and then it would kind of, taper off by the time you hit late December. And so the idea that there were only like a handful of students who were running all of this, it depends, number one, upon the history of the social movement, but also number two, this is very much a rhetorical device, which was used actually as a way in which to maintain social control by the students as they tried to maintain their strike in November and December of 1989, basically kind of demonizing those people who were not taking part in the strike. And there are actually some relatively horrific articles which come out as a result of the student activists basically saying, you people who are not staying here, you don't have the right then to say how this world is going to be created. So I just want to kind of make sure that we don't, once again, mistake this idea of the narration of the events with an analytical category, because this is actually, these are two very different things. And that particular explanation actually was most certainly, it was part of kind of the narration of the revolution itself, which had a very specific purpose. However, your youth groups, absolutely. And I don't touch upon the youth groups because this is not just the counterculture, but it's the social movements, the entire konkretny generation that Patrick Kenny talks about. You're absolutely correct. And in that, they are actually going to have a different view on generation, in part because a student identity is, like generation and revolution, a very specific social identity from the modern era. Students as the future elites, students connected to national mission. And so to analyze students within broader youth cultures actually would it would sublimate the specific identities that students have at their disposal to rouse the nation and to connect their interest with a quote-unquote national interests of the nation, which is something which is very powerful at the hands of student movements that even you had Brontosaurus, you know, which is part of the student, but Brontosaurus was never able to mobilize, you know, as many people ecologically as the students were in terms of parents stand up for the nation. You cannot have these police be beating their children. Different discourses, different identities, and so there most certainly is that. But you're absolutely correct. If you were to look at the youth more broadly, as you did, this picture would definitely change. You're absolutely correct there. In response to your question, the students actually, in that particular respect, do help shape the narrative of the Velvet Revolution. They get the title of Zapalki, or the people who started it all. And so, in socioeconomically speaking, they might be kind of pushed out of this dominant, the production of this particular narrative, but in terms of the legitimation of the revolution, which emerges in November and December 1989, indeed, it's only the students in Czechoslovakia who can honestly or authentically claim that they had the revolution stolen from them, the Ukradena revoluce, which we've talked about, this stolen revolution motif in almost every single East European country. In the case of Czechoslovakia, the students get that claim because they were the ones, even though incorrectly, they were the ones who were seen as starting it all. November 17th, they're the ones who create this nationwide mobilization. And so, socioeconomically, you might be correct, but within the narrative itself, the students have a privileged position.
Just shortly on denial. Well, absolutely. I mean, these refashionings, political refashionings, are done in order to fit present-day, very pragmatic sometimes political goals and choices. And as you know, probably a lot of the politicians in the former Yugoslavia chose to ride on the nationalist wave, because this was seen as the new, really catchy paradigm, which assured political success. Just to quote a recent example, actually, the present Croatian president, Ivo Josipovic, was also part of the youth organization, of the music section, so not the political core, but anyway, recently he sacked his main advisor because of a scholarly text where his advisor, Professor Dejan Jovic, the author of one of the more famous books on Yugoslavia, because he argued that the independence referenda in the 1991 in the former Yugoslavia were not democratic. Actually, they might have been democratic, but they were not liberal, and that people were not allowed to voice their opinions about different visions about their state or about Yugoslavia. So he was sacked for this. So. And although the Croatian president is on the left, etc., he's not a nationalist, he's not a member of a right-wing party, he still decided to do this by a lot of public uproar and debates about freedom of speech again, 25 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. So what I want to say is that politicians are pragmatic and they would rather choose the national, dominant, even dogmatic truth rather than kind of be truthful to their own personal, maybe, ideals.
Now, Mr. von Plato. No. Just.
To make it more complicated even, I have the observation that my interviews of the activists of 1989 in the GDR and I think in other places as well changed their self-construction as a generation, in my opinion. For instance, they were in their own letters or diaries or what they read in that time much more left than they talk today about their opinion in that days. And the group is much bigger today, which calls itself as 1989er or 1968er than it was at that time. And my question to you is, do you have the same observation first? And how touch this construction, the self-construction, and it's changing the analytic form, your analytic form of constructing the generation of the activists you asked? And perhaps, if you can, how can we look at or see this problem that the groups are changing and why? It's not only because of the self-construction, it is because of the media and other offers from above that the groups are bigger or not as big as in their times. That's it.
Thank you. I have just a brief question to Ljubica Spaskovska. How does the experience of having gone through the wars of the 1990s, for those of your respondents who actually experienced them within Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, and so on, come into play? This form of idealizing Yugoslavia as a country, socialism plus the good passport to travel everywhere, is quite familiar. But I sometimes have the impression that it's also a way of covering up of and getting around speaking about the really traumatic experiences.
Burkhard Storia from Ilia State University, Georgia. So my question would be some kind of continuation, or this question is triggered off by this discussion, and both from auditorium and from presenters, and especially from Discussant also. First part of question was referred that generation is some kind of self-presentation of the persons who participate in the events of late 80s, but there was also expressed doubts about a kind of analytical validity of this term generally, because whether we can use this term concerning this activist or not. I'm interested, and I would like to appreciate answers from both of you. Okay, we understand how the guys present themselves and their generation or not, but how can science scholars provide analytical tools or instruments in order to describe someone as a part of generation? What is your instrument for this? Someone presents himself as a part of generation, but how do you decide these are part of not this generation? Thank
you. Yes. Thank you for your questions. Well, starting maybe from the last, I think we already alluded or answered to it. So how we decide, or it was mainly conditioned by their self-definitions in the 80s, by the state perspective on this, by sociologists from the time, and critically reflecting on present-day generational self-definition. So it was a combination of factors why I decided personally to treat these people as part of a generation, and especially I took the institutional framework of the League of Socialist Youth of Yugoslavia in the 1980s. So these people sharing a very similar form of activism and exchange of ideas and debates. In terms of the experience of war and idealizing the state, I absolutely agree with you. And as I pointed out, it's specifically prominent in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which was the country most affected by the wars of the Yugoslav dissolution, but also in other places like Macedonia or Serbia or Slovenia, which did not experience a violent conflict. This narrative is present. In Bosnia, it does provide a way of, some type of escapism or a way to escape, as you say, the traumatic past and really to dwell on something which provided a better common platform. But for me, because I did also my master thesis on Slovenia, I was shocked. I didn't expect there to find any nostalgia at all, considering the developments in Slovenia in the late 1980s. But surprisingly, it's the place in the former Yugoslavia where really this scene of so-called Tito nostalgia, there are different terms, Yugo nostalgia, the so-called Balkan music scene, they're very active and prominent. So, but that's another topic, I guess. And I think that's all.
Actually, just to kind of pick up on those ideas, the problematic of generation was something which was both articulated as well as part of the official discourse, and so methodologically speaking, we can think about dominant versus subversive narratives. I just want to kind of bring up another point there, articulated versus latent generation, because I did a couple of supplementary oral histories with people who were socially kind of in age cohort part of this generation, and they too continue to, some of them also appropriate the generational identity as an explanatory tool, kind of explaining why their generation does this particular thing. This is how they explain the world. One phrase which sticks out from one of the women I talked to was, as a generation, she feels as though she's constantly trying to keep up, precisely because she lived through this transition, and so she had to learn the rules of the game and kind of reconstruct her biography afterwards. And so these things which are not political, they actually can also be just part of your everyday, ordinary experience. And even for people who aren't actually active in the Velvet Revolution, they still experience this caesura. And so they can appropriate generation to explain their activities as well. And that might explain why you have this increasing membership of generation. And people who are there, and the 68ers most certainly, and this is part of an ongoing debate as to exactly who can legitimately appropriate this particular identity. And part of it is, we can most certainly say, kind of with the traditional explanation here, people trying to get glory after the fact, trying to insert themselves into history where they might not necessarily have actually taken an active part there. But we also need to remember that age and generation, like I said, is an explanatory factor even outside of political history. And so, sorry? I do talk very quickly, don't I? I am so sorry about that. Sorry. Generation is, it is, it's almost like I can't think whenever, okay. It's part of ordinary strategies for people to explain their world. And so in that particular respect, there are many cultural understandings, for example, in the case of the 68ers, unfulfilled expectations. In the case of the 89ers, kind of this desire for personal freedom. And these moral and cultural normatives which are inserted over time into this broad-based understanding of generation. This actually, in turn, can attract adherents who believe that this particular explanation of the world speaks to something that they believe is valid for their particular life. I don't necessarily know the answer, but that's perhaps another alternative explanation. In the case of the activists, they actually don't necessarily start off leftist. They start off apolitical, but most certainly collectivist. And the second example that I used, kind of this emergence of an individualistic response, actually is a 180 opposite to the collectivist nature of the student movement, to the point to where you actually had suggestions of having a collective human chain hunger strike, which, if you think about it, kind of defeats the purpose of a hunger strike. You have one person doing it one day, another person doing it another day, another person doing it the other day, but it emphasized the jednota je sila, in unity is strength. And that was very much part of the credo of the student movement. They actually don't become leftist as much as very liberal. Many of the activists actually support Klaus and the ODS in 1990, and so they actually turned to the right wing pretty early on.
Well, just shortly, in the Yugoslav case, you're right, that critique in the 80s was really coming from the left, although it was colored with a lot of liberal ideas, freedom of speech, human rights, etc., but it was couched still in a socialist vocabulary. And I mentioned these activists in the late 80s, they were defining themselves as liberal socialists, whatever that meant, but this was, and later, only later after 91, they turned into liberals.
So now we're coming then to the end of the second panel. I thank again Ljubica Spaskovska, Deanna Wooley, and Lars Breuer for your comment and for your patience. And now it's time then for lunch. Enjoy it, and we will see you again at 2:30 with interview part of Lutz Niethammer. Thank you very much.